The world of the pirate was one of wind, water, and sudden, brutal violence. The Golden Age of Piracy, stretching from the late 17th to the early 18th century, saw hundreds of vessels crewed by desperate men roaming the Caribbean and the Atlantic. Their lives were defined by the pursuit of plunder and the constant threat of death, not only from enemy broadsides, but from the mundane yet lethal dangers of shipboard life. A fall from the rigging, a snapped line, a misstep on a wet deck during a storm could shatter a limb. The tools of their trade, cutlasses, pistols, cannons, were equally unforgiving. In this world, a serious injury was not merely a personal tragedy, it was a direct threat to the entire crew's operational strength and survival. This made the state of medical care on a pirate ship a matter of critical, often grim, importance. Medical knowledge in this era was a confusing blend of ancient tradition, superstition, and emerging, often misguided, science. The dominant theory of the time was the humoral system, which held that health depended on a balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance, often treated with purges, bloodletting, or the application of leeches. Germ theory was over a century away, so the concept of infection as caused by invisible organisms was unknown. Surgeons and their patients understood that wounds could turn bad, but they attributed this to bad air or an internal imbalance rather than bacteria. This fundamental misunderstanding shaped every aspect of treatment, from the initial cleaning of a wound to the desperate decision to amputate a limb. On a naval or merchant vessel, a surgeon was a standard, if not always skilled, member of the crew. Pirate ships, operating outside any formal administration, had to secure such expertise by other means. A pirate surgeon was often a pressed man, a captured naval surgeon or a barber surgeon from a taken prize who was given the stark choice: join the crew or face marooning, or worse. His value was immense. Articles of agreement, the contracts that governed many pirate crews, frequently stipulated that the surgeon would receive a larger share of any plunder, sometimes equal to that of the quartermaster, recognizing his specialized and vital role. He was responsible for treating everything from scurvy and tropical fevers to the ghastly trauma of battle. His success or failure directly impacted morale and the crew's ability to continue their raids. The surgeon's workspace was the cockpit, a low, cramped space below decks near the stern. It was dark, lit by flickering lanterns that cast shifting shadows. The ship's motion was ever present, a rolling and pitching that made delicate work nearly impossible. The air was thick with the smells of tar, bilge water, unwashed bodies, and the coppery scent of blood. His tools were crude but purposeful: saws for amputation, knives for cutting away dead flesh, probes for extracting bullets or splinters, and cautery irons to sear bleeding vessels. Alcohol, usually rum or brandy, served as both the primary anesthetic for the patient and the only antiseptic for the instruments. Opium might be available in a rare and well-stocked medicine chest, but more often, the only pain relief was a leather strap to bite down on and a strong dose of courage. The heat in the confined space could be oppressive, and the sounds of the sea and the ship provided a chaotic, unceasing backdrop. The challenges faced by these men were staggering. They worked without x-rays, without antibiotics, without sterile technique, and often without adequate supplies replenished only when a captured prize yielded a fresh medicine chest. They battled not just the injury itself, but the almost inevitable infection that followed. In the warm, damp, and filthy conditions of a ship at sea, any open wound was a gateway for disease. This set the stage for the most feared outcome of any significant injury: gangrene. For a pirate who suffered a compound fracture or a deep laceration, the real fight for life began not with the initial impact, but in the days that followed, in that dark, rolling cockpit, under the care of a man doing his best with tools and knowledge that were, by modern standards, horrifyingly inadequate. The surgeon's grim task was not just to repair damage, but to wage a war against an invisible enemy he did not understand. In an environment perfectly designed to aid that enemy's victory, the wooden deck of a pirate ship was never a safe place. A man could lose his footing during a storm and smash his leg against a cannon. A frayed rope under tension could whip around and break a shin bone like a dry twig. During a boarding action, an enemy cutlass could slice through muscle and tendon in a single wild swing. But the actual wound was rarely the real problem. The real problem began days later, when the flesh around the injury started to change color. What happened inside a wounded leg was invisible to the men who had to live with it. The body's own tissues began to die, cut off from blood supply by damaged arteries or by swelling that squeezed vessels shut. Bacteria from dirty cloth? From seawater? From the unwashed hands of the ship's carpenter who acted as surgeon? Invaded the dead tissue and multiplied. The infection produced gases that built up under the skin. The leg swelled. The skin turned a sickly greenish black. The smell was unmistakable, a sweet, rotting odor that no amount of ocean breeze could carry away. The men called it the mortification. The medical term was gangrene, from the Greek word for gnawing sore. But the pirates did not need fancy words. They knew what it meant. A man with gangrene had, perhaps a week, maybe less, before the toxins overwhelmed his body. His pulse would race. His skin would grow hot and dry. He would become confused, then delirious, then he would stop breathing. The ship's log from a merchant vessel in 1721 recorded that a sailor with a gangrenous leg died on the 7th day, screaming until his voice gave out. The only known treatment was amputation. Cut off the dead limb before the poison spread to the rest of the body. In theory, it made sense. In practice, it was a desperate gamble. The pirate ship carried no anesthesia, no sterile instruments, no blood transfusions. The carpenter's saw was the same tool used to cut spars and planks. The wound was sealed with a red-hot iron, a process called cauterization, which stopped the bleeding but also burned the flesh and created a fresh surface for infection. The survival rate after amputation on a pirate ship was appallingly low. Historians estimate that perhaps 1 in 3 men survived the operation. The other 2 died from shock, from blood loss, or from the same infection that had killed the leg. The body, already weakened by the gangrene, could not withstand the trauma of the sore and the fire. A man who survived the first day might still die a week later when the stump became infected. The medical understanding of the time simply could not explain why some wounds healed and others did not. The men knew this. They had seen it happen. A pirate with a gangrenous leg faced a terrible choice. He could submit to the amputation, knowing that the odds were against him. Or he could refuse and wait for the gangrene to finish its work. Some chose the saw, hoping for a miracle. Others chose to die whole with the leg still attached. The ship's surgeon, if the ship had one, could only offer rum and a piece of leather to bite on. There was one other factor that made gangrene so deadly at sea. The ships carried no fresh vegetables or fruits on long voyages. The crew lived on salt, pork, hardtack, and water that had gone stale in wooden casks. This diet lacked vitamin C, which the body needs to repair damaged tissue and fight infection. A sailor with scurvy had gums that bled and wounds that would not close. His body was already failing before the gangrene ever started. The combination of scurvy and gangrene was almost always fatal. The dread of gangrene hung over every pirate crew like a constant shadow. Men checked their own legs every morning, looking for the first signs of discoloration. They watched their shipmates with a fearful eye. A man who stumbled on deck was helped up quickly, not out of kindness, but out of self-interest. An injured man was a liability. A man with gangrene was a dead man walking, and everyone on the ship knew it. The final twist of this grim reality was that many amputations were performed unnecessarily. The ship's surgeon, if he was even trained at all, could not reliably tell the difference between a deep infection that might heal and a true gangrene that would kill. He saw swelling and discoloration and reached for the saw. Some men lost legs to the surgeon's fear rather than to the disease itself. The line between saving a life and ending it was drawn in blood on a wooden table, with no one to say which side was which. The pirate surgeon's world was one of brutal pragmatism, defined by the grim tools he carried and the even grimmer odds he faced. His primary instrument for a gangrenous limb was the amputation saw, a crude but necessary device. The procedure was swift and horrific. A tourniquet made of rope or leather would be tightened above the wound. The surgeon would make a circular cut through skin and muscle before sawing through the bone itself. Speed was essential, not for precision, but to limit the time a man spent in excruciating pain. and to reduce blood loss. There were no anesthetics beyond a bottle of rum or a leather strap to bite down on. The screams of the patient were a constant feature of the surgeon's work, a sound as familiar as the creak of the ship's timbers. Following the amputation, the stump would be cauterized with a hot iron or boiling pitch to seal the blood vessels and, it was hoped, prevent further infection. This act itself was another layer of agony. The leading cause of death after such an operation was not the initial shock or blood loss, though both were significant, but the subsequent infection that almost inevitably set in. The concept of germs was unknown, and antiseptic conditions were impossible on a wooden ship swarming with vermin and soaked in bilge water. Bandages were often reused, and instruments were wiped clean at best. Gangrene frequently returned in the stump, sealing a man's fate. Beyond the sore, the surgeon's chest held other dubious remedies. For wounds not yet requiring amputation, he might attempt poultices made from moldy bread, herbs, or even animal dung, believing these could draw out the poison. Leeches were sometimes applied to balance the body's humors. Wounds might be irrigated with salt water or cheap wine. The success of these treatments was sporadic at best. For internal ailments or fevers following injury, the surgeon relied on purgatives and emetics, medicines that violently emptied the body, further weakening a patient who needed all his strength to survive. The line between treatment and torture was often vanishingly thin. A pirate faced with gangrene knew his choices were stark. He could refuse the surgeon and die slowly as the rot spread, a process accompanied by putrid smell and delirious pain. Or he could submit to the saw and the hot iron, gambling on a slim chance for a few more years of life, albeit profoundly altered. The psychological landscape for a pirate who survived such an ordeal was complex. The loss of a limb was a fundamental transformation of identity. A pirate's worth was measured in his physical capacity to climb rigging, haul rope, fight in boarding actions, and simply remain on his feet during a storm. Losing a leg rendered most of these tasks impossible. While popular myth portrays pirates with peg legs and hooks as commonplace, historical evidence suggests such adaptations were rare survivals. A man who could no longer perform his duties became a burden on a crew that operated on strict, often ruthless, principles of utility. Some captains might grant a pension of a few pieces of eight, or allow a survivor to serve as a cook or a stores keeper in a safe port. But many were simply put ashore at the next island or port, left to beg or find a new trade. The emotional toll was immense. These men had chosen a life of danger for the promise of freedom and prize money. Surviving a catastrophic injury meant confronting a future of dependence and poverty, a bitter reward for their resilience. Their toughness was not a romantic adventure, but a stark, unyielding fact of their existence. Yet, within this harsh reality, a peculiar form of respect could emerge. A pirate who endured the surgeon's saw and lived was a testament to sheer physical fortitude. His survival against overwhelming odds commanded a grim admiration from his peers. It proved his mettle in the most final way possible. Some of these men, through sheer force of will, did learn to navigate a rolling deck with a crutch or a carved stump. They might take on roles as lookouts, helmsmen, or even strategic advisors during attacks, their experience valued even if their mobility was limited. Their presence served as a constant, visceral reminder to the rest of the crew of the stakes of their profession. Every man could look at such a survivor and understand the true cost of a splinter, a fall, or a musket ball. This created a brutal, unspoken bond. The survivor's ordeal was a shared trauma, a lesson written not in a logbook, but in scar tissue and absent limbs. It was a daily demonstration that on a pirate ship, resilience was not a virtue but a necessity, and sometimes the only victory was simply enduring the cure. The high probability of death following a severe injury shaped the culture of piracy in tangible ways. Pirate articles, those written agreements that governed life aboard many vessels, often included provisions for compensation following an amputation. These clauses were not acts of charity, but of brutal economic pragmatism. A pirate who lost a limb was no longer a fully capable fighter or sailor. His share of future plunder was diminished, but a lump sum payment, perhaps 700 pieces of eight for a lost right arm, served as a final settlement. It was a cold calculation, acknowledging the end of a man's useful service while attempting to prevent discontent among the crew. This system underscores a harsh truth. On a pirate ship, a man's value was measured directly against his physical capacity for labor and violence. When Gangrene claimed a limb, it often claimed that value entirely. The limited medical understanding of the era also fueled the folklore that grew around pirates in the centuries that followed. The iconic image of the peg-legged buccaneer, while rooted in truth, is a romanticized simplification. For every sailor who survived an amputation and adapted with a crude prosthesis, many more succumbed to infection, shock, or the subsequent perils of a life altered by disability. The stories that survived, however, were those of the resilient few. These narratives were amplified in popular pamphlets and later in novels, transforming desperate survival into a symbol of rugged individualism. The reality was far less glorious. The development of this folklore serves as a testament to a human tendency to reshape raw suffering into a more palatable, even heroic, legend. It obscures the silent majority who died in agony below decks, their names lost to the ledger books of ship's surgeons and the vast indifference of the sea. Examining this history yields clear lessons for modern medicine, though they are lessons learned through immense suffering. The pirate era's experience with gangrene was a protracted, large-scale trial in pre-antibiotic wound management. Every failed poultice, every botched amputation, and every observation of which wounds turned fatal contributed, however minutely, to a collective body of hard-won knowledge. Surgeons of the time, working without an understanding of germ theory, still empirically recognized the signs of spreading infection. Their crude attempts at antisepsis, using substances like vinegar or wine, hinted at a correct principle even if the execution was flawed. The stark outcomes aboard ship provided undeniable evidence of the body's response to massive infection, evidence that would later help frame the scientific questions leading to the discovery of bacteria and antibiotics. In this way, the grim fate of countless pirates and sailors became data points in the long, painful road to modern surgical sanitation. The sacrifices made by those men were not voluntary contributions to science. They were the brutal consequences of a dangerous profession operating at the very edge of contemporary medical knowledge. Their experiences force a reflection on the nature of progress. Modern advancements in trauma surgery, battlefield medicine, and antibiotics stand in direct contrast to the horrors of the pirate surgeon's cockpit. Each sterile bandage and each dose of effective antibiotic carries with it the silent echo of those who died for lack of such things. To appreciate this history is to understand medicine not as a static gift, but as a hard-fought achievement, built upon a foundation of countless individual tragedies. The story of Gangrene on a pirate ship is ultimately a story of human resilience confronting the limits of its time. It commands a respect not for the mythologized violence of piracy, but for the profound vulnerability of the people who lived and died within that world, and for the incremental, often tragic, process through which knowledge is won.